Welcome to Tyre and Rubber Recycling Podcast 75 with me, Ewan Scott. In this episode, we talk with Stacey Jansen and Alex Erdmann from South Africa's REDISA. Before we start though, don't forget to like and subscribe to this video to stay updated. And you can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn and WhatsApp. Or, of course, subscribe to the magazine for regular updates. So, to the podcast subject. REDISA operated as a waste tyre management organisation in South Africa for 4.5 years. It would be fair to say that the longer term goal was wider waste management, but REDISA started by focusing on one area, tyres. Having established a system that was pulling in recycling fees, funding new start businesses, and managing to hold tyre reserve down to 20,000 tonnes, REDISA was abruptly shut down by the then South African Environment Minister Molewa. Since 2017, the fees have still been collected, but there has been no waste tyre management until early in 2025, when the Tyre Waste Management Plan was introduced. However, by June, it had been recalled, leaving South Africa with no plan and an estimated stockpile of 900,000 tonnes of tyres. In this podcast, we asked Stacey Jansen and Alex Erdmann what went wrong. And for clarity for those outside South Africa, there is a reference here to the Hawks. The Hawks is a common name for the Directorate of Priority Crime Investigation. Stacey, when I visited REDISA, I think it was back in 2017, things were looking really good. You had a system coming into place, you were employing people, you were distributing funds to the people at the bottom end of the chain, you were starting to collect tyres. What went wrong?
It's a very complex story as to what went wrong, but when I look at the facts and hindsight, of course, which is perfect vision, what went wrong was REDISA was too successful. We were collecting too much money. And when you consider the context we were operating in at the time, looking at the state capture stories that came out post 2017, this was just another case of a nice hot company that was doing well, collecting lots of money, and in the Zuma regime, that meant that we need to get our hands on the money. And that's evidenced by what actually happened in terms of changes in legislation, where they changed our funding model. When we launched an application to review that change to the legislation, and they realized that that application had prospects of success, they then launched an audit utilizing a company which weren't even auditors, called Solvit, to come and do a performance review, because you must remember our approval was subject to the conditions of approval, and our withdrawal, the withdrawal of the REDISA plan could only happen if REDISA wasn't performing. So they started this performance review, which also went belly up because, one, they weren't through auditors, two, the reports we could file very strong rebuttals to. And when the minister realized that they'd not trying to take over the company by way of a withdrawal and transfer the assets to the Waste Bureau, she then issued a directive one day before our response was due in 2016. And that directive resulted in another court application, which was eventually set aside by Judge Dennis Davis, who actually found that the minister's conduct to be something to behold. It was just not stately. But anyway, he set aside this withdrawal, and of course, that set this whole agenda to take over the company and its assets back to square one. We don't have any way of hold our hands on the assets. And so what the state then decided to do was start, when the minister was forced to withdraw that directive at the end of January, we now know from correspondence that was handed back to us after the liquidation that the Hawks were then contacted to start investigating allegations of criminality, which is also typical if you look at some other incidences in South Africa. There's always, how do we actually remove the leadership out, and we start a narrative in the press, which is why there was the carte blanche expose on corruption and fraud and all kinds of crazy allegations. And the Hawks found no evidence to support the allegations. And this is when we also, at the same time that they approached the Hawks, we had also filed, we required them to file their papers with regards to us trying to set aside the change to the funding model. And what happened then was that they used that opportunity to go on an ex parte basis as a headshot to take us out. They went to approached the courts for an ex parte liquidation order, which was successful. And so the only thing I can say about, in a nutshell, what happened to REDISA was we were just another victim of state capture, really. It just didn't, the captured part didn't happen. And we were able to fight back and win. And that's what the SCA found as well.
Okay. I mean, you touched on the point that you were being successful, you were bringing in a lot of funding. There was a parallel in Ontario in Canada, where the Tyre stewardship scheme had been very successful, and people looked at it and they thought there's too much money here, and they wound up a very successful scheme. And it seems that the same thing happened in South Africa. And of course, REDISA was never popular with the tyre manufacturers, as I recall. So they probably I'm guessing, had a role to play in what went on behind the scenes.
I don't think so. I don't think that they played a role in the specific attack on REDISA. I think what happened was that when you look at how much REDISA collected, which equated to roughly 700 million rand, 82% of that REDISA paid back into the market. And us administrating that amount of money basically caught the attention of the wrong crowd. And some of the Zuma's henchmen approached us directly, and they asked us for a bribe in money terms, as well cash in a bag, as well as
15% equity stake
in the management company. And we said no. And at the time, I remember the moment quite clearly. I was sitting in Hout Bay with my father. We received a call that made it clear in no uncertain terms that if he doesn't do that, they will come after him, and that they would put us in jail. And I remember my father's reply being, well, last time I checked, I needed to do something to be put in jail. And they said, don't worry, everybody has something. The difference was that we hadn't done anything. And we had to prove that going through the court case. And we won that. And obviously the courts vindicated us. But the real victims in this is that since then, REDISA employed roughly 3,500 people. We had about 440 contracts, and the 82% of the money collected was going actually back into the market,
into building new
and creating the infrastructure in order to recycle tires. And I think that recycling generally is more of a commercial problem than it is an environmental one, in the sense that if the economies make sense, recycling will happen. That's why we have no problem in the steel industry, because turning scrap steel back into steel is cheaper than turning iron ore into steel. And in tires, the commercial side doesn't make sense, and REDISA covered that gap. The difference of where we ended up is that now the REDISA fee is still being collected, the R2.30 per kilo of rubber imported or manufacturers, but it goes into the fiscus and it's no longer a fee, it's a tax. And the difference there is that with a tax, there is no direct duty to spend the money on remediation of waste tires. And what's happening is that less than half of what is being collected actually ends up back in the industry. And now it doesn't make commercial sense to recycle. And we see these depots overflowing. There are next to no legitimate recyclers anymore because the commercial side simply doesn't make sense. So they have promulgated plans over the years. Stacey can speak more into the detail of that, but those plans don't make sense, not even paragraph to paragraph. And we opposed it because we said, you know, they make multiple stakeholders responsible for the same value chain. And they say that in one of the versions, they said that private industry is not allowed to own any of the assets, but yet they take on all the responsibility. These things just don't make sense. No entrepreneur would be willing to invest in that market.
What we do have now is an industry who's manufacturing tires, collecting fees from the public and consumers, passing it on to the state and not getting any service in return. And so far, the South African public have contributed 5.3, I think it's about 5.3 billion when I last checked last year, with the last budget. 5.3 billion rand has been collected since February 2017. And we're sitting with a 900,000 ton backlog. So where's the money going? That's question number one. Second thing is the tire industry, under REDISA, they may not have liked the fact that they weren't in control of the funds, but at least we guaranteed that their responsibility to remediate the tires in a responsible way was happening, and it was guaranteed. And right now they're paying, but they're not getting that security. Their tires are still being dumped illegally, still being binned, still being resold and regrooved. And that's a problem. And that's a problem we need to fix. The industry need to have peace of mind that if they are collecting money and they are contributing to a fund to remediate, that they get those services in return. And we could guarantee them those services.
You see, what the industry didn't like, what the new tire manufacturers didn't like, is that what we were proposing is that if a tire manufacturer manufactures a tire that is easier for us to recycle later, so it's designed to be recycled, why should that tire pay the same fee as a tire which is using materials which make it far more difficult for us to recycle? So we wanted to put in a grading system like they do on other products like Greenerpunkt does, and then have a rating per tire, and then accordingly have a fee. But the only way to do that would be to independently test the tires and then grade them accordingly. And that would include chemical tests, but also, you know, if a tire lasts 10% longer than its opposition, that should be a benefit to the consumer. And as such, the manufacturers should benefit from a lower fee. They don't want somebody else to have that level of insight. So it's understandable that they opposed it at the time. But the fact is that for the consumer, that would be the right way to go. We should be positively incentivizing industry to design products that are easier to deal with at the end of life.
At the moment, you have nothing because the industry tire waste management plan was introduced, I think, in February this year, and it's already been dropped. What was wrong with that plan?
Our action, we legally opposed it. It was quite a big undertaking. And they simply just, a couple of days before they were due to file their record of decision, they withdrew the plan. And the reason is because there are certain hurdles they can't overcome. It doesn't make sense.
Maybe I should just take the opportunity to contextualize how we got to the second version of the plan. As you well know, REDISA was successful at having this liquidation order overturned. And in 2019, the then Minister Minister Mvula Mokonyane, called us to a meeting to say we need to resolve this because we have a major waste tire problem in the country. We don't have a working solution. At that stage, we didn't have a plan. The Waste Management Bureau was trying to manage waste. And we got into negotiations onto how could the REDISA plan be reinstated. Unfortunately, in June of 2019, it was a national election. And then we had a reshuffle of cabinet and a new minister, Minister Patrick Creasy, came, was appointed as the Minister of Environmental Affairs. And now you've got to start all over again. Her approach was not to continue the negotiations, but instead consult the stakeholders, as far as we know. And as what she basically said to Parliament was that the tire manufacturers called for government to manage this plan, and that's why she opted to go the Section 29 route. So in 2020, she called all of the stakeholders, including ourselves, to a public hearing where she stated that the CSIR, which is a research institute in South Africa, has been appointed to develop a plan. One of the questions asked at that forum was, yes, but who will be managing the plan? And her response was, all of you. So that's when the light bulbs started going, all the alarm bells started going off for Herman and I, because it was clear that there is this kumbaya approach to something that is quite complex and detailed. And this is how the plan, through the COVID then hit, and of course, getting the plan through consultation, we went through 9 iterations of a plan. And some of the versions that we came across were completely bizarre. For example, the implementer or the NPC that will be responsible for managing everything would need to have, will have to carry all the liability, but all assets procured would belong to the state. I mean, it's just, when you try and structure a contractual arrangement or try and get a board to serve on an organization that's going to have a liability but no corresponding asset, it just makes absolutely no sense. But we gave very, very comprehensive commentaries to all these drafts of the plan. And in 2024, last year, when they published the plan, they basically railroaded it. It didn't follow the proper procedure in terms of its publication for comment. In fact, normally what happens is we all get circulars. There was nothing of the sort. We found out by accident afterwards when the plan was approved. So yes, we did challenge the plan, not only because of the procedural flaw, but also all the internal flaws of the plan. It's just not a plan. That's the bottom line. It's a framework to establish a plan. It has multiple players with no clear lines in terms of responsibilities and roles. And it's, again, another project that the state is managing, utilizing state resources or taxpayers' money, that we can see the train waiting to hit the brick wall.
For example, it has no budget.
Yeah, so we had an obligation to launch litigation. And I think the fact that it was withdrawn now recently, it can't be a coincidence that it gets withdrawn a few days before the state is due to file its record of decision. And so, yeah, as much as the minister has made a media statement to say that, you know, he's reviewing all decisions taken by predecessors, I think they do have some serious technical issues with the plan, as well as procedural flaws. And we would have been successful if we had this matter gone to court. So I welcome the fact that the minister has actually withdrawn it. It's a prudent thing to do. Let's save taxpayers' money and let's go back to the drawing board. That's really...
Okay, so where does South Africa go from here? What happens next?
Well, that's going to be very interesting, because even no matter how hard I try and process in a rational way, I say to myself, if I was a completely neutral person sitting on the outside and I was to tell you that South Africa has a solution that will drive, economic growth, remediate the waste tyres, create jobs, create new industries, and cost nothing to the state. In other words, the fiscus won't need to invest anything. It can be privately run and managed with us reporting and being accountable to the state. Considering the context that we're in now and the state that the country is in terms of resources, low economic growth, low job creation initiatives, a very tiny taxpayer base, a burdened tiny taxpayer base, then it's a no-brainer for me that the state would approach a company like REDISA, because all of the concerns that were raised before in terms of things, crazy allegations like lack of governance and non-performance and all these things that were thrown out in the media at the time when the liquidation was playing itself out. All of those things have been addressed by the courts. All of those things have been found to be complete. In fact, the words that the judge used was fantastic. He said there's not one iota of evidence. It's not as if there were a few things. There was nothing. So what I'm saying is we have a working model with a track record, with hot bodies who benefited from it, a nation who, at no cost to the fiscus, and yet we're still willing to spend money on appointing another organ of state now. The CSIR has to go back to the drawing board. And in a recent waste management forum, they deemed the 5 years that it took to get this plan out in 2024 as a rushed job. And I found that deeply insulting to the South African public. You know, if 5 years is a rush job, I'd hate to think what the normal procedures mean in terms of time. And we can save all of that. I mean, it will take, there's a process enshrined in law already. There's a plan that has been drafted and submitted to the department, taking into account all of the learnings we got from implementing the first version of the plan. And nobody wants to talk to us.
I also think that the reality of the industry at the moment and the market is such that when you go out to these waste depots, they are far from what even by their standard would be deemed compliant. And I mean, it's a mess. And the waste tire crisis is real. We hear stories of how tires are getting burnt and how there are private contractors dealing in that market. And the logical answer is simply that REDISA should be reinstated, and that should there be any, they should work with us. If there are things that they were not happy with or did not like, this should be worked out through consultation and engagement, and also in a forum where we have a right to defend why certain things are done a certain way. Because we did learn through the implementation of the REDISA plan what to do and what not to do. And there are, for a lot of these, you know, it's a little bit like saying, I like the chocolate cake you made, but I would like you to change this in the recipe and change that in the recipe. Well, if you change too much of it, then it's fundamentally not the cake that you like to start with.
Well, it's not even a cake. That's the big
So I think that we are open to meeting, obviously, with the new minister and reestablishing. We also we invested a lot of money in developing reverse logistics systems with QR codes to stop round tripping, to manage the collection effectively, how we dealt with recyclers. All of these, there is an institutional knowledge, as well as there are still substantial assets that we have that are specifically for tire recycling. And as such, it would be nonsensical based on the fact that the courts have completely vindicated us, that not, at least for the short term, to try and stop the waste tire crisis in the short term, at least reinstate REDISA as it was, and then work with us going forward. That is quite honestly the logical route that we see, and that's also a route that we are pursuing.
Well, right now, with the state having been, I've been managing the waste tire problem, we do not have any statistic provided by the state in how many jobs they've supported, how many SMEs they've created, and what the tonnage is that they've actually remediated. The figures vary, the targets get kicked out year on year.
And then that gets redone. I mean, the targets then retrospectively get changed to match their performance.
And what is an interesting statistic, which I think speaks volumes, is if you look at our tenure, 2013 through to June 2017, on the day the liquidation happened, I can tell you that we had 20,000 tons of tyres in store nationally. So that was for our 4.5 years. After the Waste Management Bureau took over on the 1st of October 2017, to the point when the plan was published, and they basically for their 4.5 years, we now have an estimated 900,000 tons in storage. And this is where Alex refers to waste storage depots being non-compliant. There's no ways you can store that amount of tyres in a compliant way in approximately 35 sites. And to then bring sites to compliance, what government did was they just changed the legislation. So you couldn't have a storage facility that was bigger than 30,000 tons, and now we've just increased it to 50,000 square meters. And sorry, not tons, but square meters. You know, so it's shocking, because what that 900,000 tons tells me is how much recycling, reusing, and repurposing actually happened. And it's by the time we start interrogating these numbers, you know, I think we play personalities too much. We play people, but we're not actually playing the ball, which is the waste tyre problem. How do we fix the problem?
When with REDISA in action, you were funding the development of business. And now what you're telling me is the government is taking the tax on the tyre and not putting any of this back into the industry. So nobody is being paid. There's no investment in business, and the few operators you have are having to work on, as it were, off their own wit to make sure they have the feedstock they need in the markets they need. There's no assistance when there very well could be through a scheme like REDISA had in place.
Absolutely. I get called at least once a week with regards to that challenge. And I can tell you what some of these potential recyclers had. When we were operating our plan, we had approximately 35 recyclers at various stages. Some were operating, some were in the process of setting up their plants and commissioning the plants. But we had, over the period, built to about 35 plants. A study done by the Waste Chair in South Africa, which is a waste research body, in 2022-23, they were only able to verify 2 recyclers. So it tells you what's happened. Because there's no funding and no subsidization or incentives like free tyres being delivered to your plant, a development grant, 31 cents per kilogram of tyre that gets processed being given, these guys weren't able to stay open. And then, of course, you also have to consider that there aren't any markets for the waste tyre recycling, and that we also assisted with. And so recently, after the plan was published last year and approved, a recycler contacted me and he said to me, you know, Stacey, I have a big problem. I had a conversation with the department and the Waste Management Bureau, and one of my challenges was, if I am going to invest into a recycling plant, what kind of support will government give us with regards to developing the markets in South Africa? And the response from the Bureau was, that's not our problem, that's yours. If you're a businessman, that's your job to find markets. And what it said to me was, or what it revealed about the understanding that we have in the Waste Management Bureau, is that they don't actually understand the problem that we're dealing with and how to provide the solutions. Because, like Alex explained earlier, tyres recycled rubber cannot compete with virgin rubber prices. It's as simple as that. And so if we expect these tires to be recycled, we need to find incentives to get people to recycle. And one of those things that you do is that you obviously have a financial incentive, but you also have to have incentives for downstream markets. And when we're talking about the environmental ratings, one of the things that we should have is creating recycled standards. So having grades of crumb, for example, that get used for certain applications. Because when people get a guarantee of or consistent quality, people are willing to invest in brick making, in acoustic mat making, molding, and all of those kinds of things.
Tires you can
or even remaking tires. But you need to introduce, it's a slow, painful process because unfortunately it does require time to build industries. That's what we're doing. The REDISA plan effectively is looking to build a waste tire industry, and we have to incubate that industry. And the incubation program looks at financial support, operational support, and market support. And that's really what we try to do through the REDISA plan. It's not just a matter of, oh, well, we need to have people recycling. It's far more complex than that.
It's actually, when you look at it, it is a commercial solution to waste that as a side effect cleans the environment. It's actually, that's
all about economics will fit, and this is exactly why we have huge debates around the linear economy, the circular economy, and what we saw with extended producer responsibility as a legislative tool is that it is the perfect bridge to take us from linear to circular without much disruption. And that's really what we proved as a concept with waste tires with the REDISA plan. And this plan can be applied to any waste. It's the same thing you have with plastics. So if you want to have a circular economy, you have to change the way products are designed. But how do we do it in a way that doesn't disrupt current markets? And the way you do that is by implementing EPR, creating the incentives over time to transition to clean technology. And once we have that happening, it's going to be much easier. But for us to all sit back and expect industries to retrofit plants to clean technology with little, it's crazy. People just cannot afford to do the right thing.
With the current commercial linear economy, when you've invested into a factory and you have got a certain path dependency, you have invested in this technology, and it doesn't, doing the right thing now and converting your plant will financially penalize you, and ultimately you will be penalized for doing the right thing. So we have to create an economic environment where when you do the right thing, you actually economically benefit. And to overcome that, for example, one of the mechanisms within REDISA is that portion of the funding would go towards, if you are a manufacturer and I come to you and I say, we will invest, we will give you money so that you change your factory to a greener model, so that the tires that we have to deal with later are easier, and we spend less money cleaning the river rather than
stopping the pollution happening in the first place.
Just as an example.
Yeah. I think also what we identified is important. I'm sure most of your viewers know football. Can you imagine if Manchester and Liverpool got to the Manchester derby and had different sets of rules? Yet your spectators are coming to watch a football match, and one decides they're going to play cricket and the other decides, or rugby for that matter, and football. You have absolute chaos and everybody suffers. All that REDISA was saying is, can we be the referee? Here's a set of rules, and this game goes on. Everybody enjoys the game, spectators and participants alike. And that's really what it's all about.
I'd like to thank you for your time and for being open. It's interesting. I think although the issues in South Africa are very much focused, you mentioned the lack of understanding of recycling. The South African government is not alone in that. We see that in the UK, we see it in Italy, we see it in America, we see it
Absolutely.
in most places. But we're starting to see changes in the likes of Australia, and most recently in New Zealand, where the governments are saying, yeah, okay, we want to recycle, so we'll put incentives in place, and we will put funding in place. We will help build the industry, which is what we need. I'd like to thank you for your time. It's been very interesting. Thank you for bringing me up to date, and hopefully we can speak to you again when things take a turn for the better.
Yes.
We hope so. We'll definitely keep you informed, and I'll stay in touch and keep
Thank you for hosting
updated.
us.
But thanks for hosting us. Yeah.
I have to thank Stacey Jansen and Alex Erdmann for their forthright thoughts on the situation in South Africa. It has the makings of a political thriller with the actions they tell us about. As an observer, I suspect the problems in South Africa are rather complex. South Africa is an enigma, a country with vast resources, but faced with a wealth gap that is difficult for an outsider to comprehend. Whilst REDISA was starting to tackle the problem of waste and entry-level employment, the reality was that certain parties could see what appeared to be large amounts of money being drawn in by the scheme. And rather than wait and see the tire waste sector develop into a burgeoning industry sector, they felt that they had to take control. In doing so, they lost sight of the need to recycle waste tires, and the fact that it is a capital-intensive business that needed funding to grow. There are clearly sensitivities in this podcast that I will allow viewers to understand from their own viewpoint. However, what is clear is that the South African government has badly misunderstood waste recycling. REDISA is still hopeful that there will be a future role for their plans, albeit modified to account for lessons learned and to meet the current demands of the South African market. Let us all hope that South Africa finds a way forwards very soon, and I have to say that I hope that the team at REDISA will have a role to play in the future scheme. We should never throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you have stuck with us through this video, which is indeed longer than most, then thanks for watching, and I hope it has been of interest. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and mind how you go. Tot ziens, mooie loop.